Welcome to week 3. Today's presentation is on ancient Greece. So what do you think of when you think of ancient Greece? Give yourself about 30 seconds. What are some things that spring to mind? When we think of ancient Greece, most of us think of the Olympics, gods, Zeus, temples, art, maybe Troy or Sparta. Maybe you even thought of democracy, statues, columns, and maybe the Trojan horse. The fundamental tenet of Western civilization is that humanity is the measure of all things. This fundamental tenet was born here in ancient Greece. The perfect individual became the Greek ideal, and the portrayal of beautiful humans became the focus of many of the greatest Greek artists. That the human, both body and spirit, is the essence and perfect manifestation of all nature, and that is the natural ruler of it, is a thoroughly Greek idea which the Romans adopt and eventually is the central idea of the Renaissance, which in turn starts a journey that leads us to the art that we make today. So this is Greece. This is a map of ancient Greece. Turkey is to the south of France. The Greeks had close contacts with other peoples, such as the Egyptians, the Syrians, and the Persians. The Greeks lived in separate city-states, but they shared the same language and religious beliefs. Probably one of the most famous city-states would be Sparta. Another would be Athens. They called themselves Hellenes, and they thought extremely highly of themselves. Anyone who didn't speak Greek was a barbarian. First, we're going to talk about the contributions of ancient Greece before we really get into the art. There are 4 major contributions. The first is philosophy. Philosophia, philo, means love in Greek, and sophia means wisdom. The history of philosophy sought to address ways in which we are unwise. Greek philosophers all sought happiness or fulfillment. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all lived in Athens. They were devoted to leading as good a life as possible within the world's troubled existence. The second major contribution of ancient Greece is democracy. Democracy was developed in different Greek city-states in the 5th century before the Common Era. Pericles, a Greek general, extols the virtue of democracy while fighting the brutal Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. Pericles describes democracy. Quote, "Our form of government is called a democracy because its administration is in the hands not of a few, but of the whole people. In the settling of private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. Election to public office is made on the basis of ability, not on the basis of membership to a particular class. No man is kept out of public office by the obscurity of his social standing because of his poverty, as long as he wishes to be of service to the state." These ideas are central to the modern idea of democracy. The third great contribution of ancient Greece was architecture. Greeks built 5 of the 7 wonders of the ancient world: the Colossal at Rhodes, the statue of Zeus at Olympus, the lighthouse at Alexandria, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, and the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. Temple architecture suggests dignity, calm, harmony, reason, and have inspired builders around the world since their creation. The architecture of these temples suggests values that humanity will always cherish or find impressive, even if they're no longer used as temples to worship Greek gods. The 2 buildings shown here on this slide are both modern interpretations of Greek architecture, the Lincoln Memorial in D.C. and the National Archives in D.C. The 4th major contribution of ancient Greece was sport. Unlike ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, nudity and grace of the human form was celebrated. That's why most of their sculptures were nude. There were competitions all the time, the most famous of which was the Olympics. Ancient Greek art typically celebrates the poise and physical beauty of athletes. The Greeks believed that a healthy mind could only dwell in a healthy body. They cherished both a healthy mind and a physically fit body. Divinity in ancient Greece was hugely integral to ancient Greek culture. These gods and goddesses will come up again and again throughout the Renaissance and even into neoclassical and even into our modern culture. So it's important to understand divinity for the ancient Grecians and also so that we can understand some analogies and metaphors and symbolism that will be used, especially during the Renaissance. So the only difference between gods and humans in ancient Greece was that gods were immortal. The Greeks made their gods into humans and their humans into gods. This supports the idea that humanity is the measure of all things, rather than some faceless, nameless divinity. This is incredibly different from the other cultures we've talked about so far, like ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, where divinity was incredibly distant from humanity. Gods were untouchable, all-powerful, and faultless. In ancient Greece, you can see the faults and mistakes and messes that gods make constantly throughout stories like Hercules. And Achilles is a really good example of a repeated storyline of the half-mortal, half-god. So, man being raised to the level of a god. So I'm going to quickly go over important Greek gods and goddesses that will come up over and over again that you might need to be familiar with, especially for the Renaissance. There are 12 Olympian deities that I'm going to go over, and they were descended from the 12 Titans. After heaven and earth mated to produce 12 Titans, including Ocean and Kronos, Kronos castrated his father to rule in his place. He swallowed all his children as they were born, until his wife, Rhea, hid Zeus from him. Zeus forced Kronos to throw up all of his siblings. Then together they overthrew Kronos and the other Titans and ruled the world from Greece's highest peak on Mount Olympus. This tale has parallels in Near Eastern mythology and pre-Greek in origin. The 12 Olympian gods figure prominently not only in Greek, Etruscan, and Roman times, but the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and into the present. Zeus, or Jupiter, as the Romans will call him, was the king of the gods. He rules the sky. His weapon is a thunderbolt. He leads the other gods to victories over the Titans. His wife and his sister is Hera, or Juno. His brothers are Poseidon, or Neptune, and Hades, Pluto. The names in parentheses are the Roman names because most of these gods were adopted by the Romans. His symbols are the thunderbolt, eagle, bull, and oak, among many others. Hera, the goddess of marriage, is the wife and sister of Zeus with symbols such as the pomegranate, peacock feather, diadem, cow, lily, and lotus. Hades and Poseidon, or Pluto and Neptune, are both Zeus's brothers. Hades is the famous god of the underworld. He never actually lived on Olympus. His symbols include the three-headed dog, Cerberus, which you may be familiar with from the Harry Potter books, Fluffy, a key, and also a scepter. Poseidon, or Neptune, is the lord of the sea. Brother to Zeus and Hades, he controls waves, storms, earthquakes with his trident. His symbols include the trident, dolphin, fish, horse, and bull. Demeter, or Ceres, is the god of agriculture. She taught humans how to sow and plow. She is the sister to Zeus and Hesta, and her symbols are the cornucopia, wheat, torch, and bread. Hesta, or Vesta, is the goddess of the hearth. She's a sister to Zeus and Demeter, and the right ordering of family, domesticity, and the state. Her symbols are also the hearth and its fire. Athena, or Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. She is the patron deity of Athens. She's Zeus's daughter, born from his head. She is a virgin. Her symbols include owls, olive trees, snakes, and a gorgon. Ares, or Mars, is the god of war. He is the son of Zeus and Aphrodite's lover. He is the father and founder of Rome, Romulus and Remus. Symbols include spear, helmet, dog, chariot, boar, vulture, and flaming torch. Vulcan is the god of fire and metalworking. He is Hera's son. He's lame and ugly. Aphrodite, his wife, is unfaithful to him. He made Achilles' armors for the Trojan War, and Zeus's scepter and Poseidon's trident. His symbols include the hammer, anvil, tongs, and quail. Apollo is the god of light and music. He is the son of Zeus and Leto. He was young, beautiful, and sometimes identified with the sun, Helios. He is a great archer. His epithet means radiant. His symbols include the lyre, laurel wreath, python, raven, bow, and arrows. Aphrodite, Artemis, and Hermes. Let's start with Aphrodite, or Venus. She is the goddess of love and beauty, the daughter of Zeus and a nymph. She was born from the sea. She's the mother to Eros, or Cupid, or Amor, erotic love, by Ares. Remember, he's the god of war. She's the mother to Trojan hero Aeneas. Her symbols include the dolphin, rose, scallop shell, dove, sparrow, mirror, and swan. Artemis, Diana, is the goddess of the hunt and wild animals. She is Apollo's twin, occasionally regarded as the moon or Selene or Luna. Her symbols include bows, arrows, stags, hunting dog, and moon. Hermes, or Mercury, is the messenger god of gods and travelers. He is the son of Zeus and a different nymph. His symbols include winged sandals, and he has winged sandals, and he guides the dead into the underworld. His symbols include the hat with wings, tortoise, lyre, and rooster. Geometric and Orientalizing Art from 900 to 600 before the Common Era. This is the era of Homer and the Olympic Games are established. The human figure returns to art. This is an era when city-states were taking shape, and Greeks began to trade with their neighbors to the east and west. Human figures in bronze statuettes and simple silhouettes, in addition to abstract motifs on geometric vases. These are the main forms of artistic expression in this time of ancient Greece. Eastern monsters begin to appear on black figure vases, and Athens starts to develop as a major city center. The Dipylon crater is one of the earliest Greek examples of figural representation. Previously, all decoration was abstract, like the key design on the top of the vessel. This was used to mark a burial site, probably for pouring libations, or liquid offerings, to the deceased. Any sense of illusion of three-dimensional forms occupying real space is avoided. This is solemn. It's funerary art focused on the emotional reactions of the survivors, not the afterlife of the dead, like in ancient Egypt. The Archaic period is the next major artistic period in ancient Greece. During the Archaic period, we see the earliest life-size koroi, which emulated the frontal poses of Egyptian statues, but these were nude, like Greek athletes. Greek sculptors also refined proportions and added archaic smiles to their figures to make them seem more lifelike. Working toward lifelike representation was the Greek artist's goal and eventual contribution to the history of art. Two Greek sculptors rejected the age-old composite view of human figures and experimented with foreshortening. Kouros is the Greek word for youth. These were life-size grave markers and votive offerings. Such statues can be colossal, that is, larger than life, or they can be less than life size. They all have a conventional pose, where the head and body can be divided equally by a central line, and the legs are parted with the weight placed equally in the front and the back. The male figures, usually in the form of a naked young man, acted as both grave markers and votive offerings, the latter perhaps intended to be representations of the dedicator. The female figures served similar functions, but differed from their male counterparts in that they were elaborately draped. Does this chorus remind you of anything? The chorus was not intended as a realistic portrait of the deceased, but an idealized representation of values and virtues to which the dead laid claim: youthful beauty, athleticism, and aristocratic bearing, among others. Hopefully this reminds you of ancient Greek sculpture from last week. This is a chorus with a statue of Menkaure. The chorus emulate the stance of Egyptian statues. They are radially front, fist clenched, with the left foot slightly advanced. They are solemn, serene faces. Both were used as funerary monuments, both made by sketching the design on all four sides of the stone. The biggest difference is the Greek statues are nude. Now look at this chorus. It's from about 2 generations after the first chorus we looked at. This was a young man named Croesus, and he died a hero's death in battle. This statue was erected for him over the grave. Some of the paint is even preserved. The inscribed base reads, "Stay and mourn at the tomb of dead Croesus, whom raging Ares destroyed one day as he fought in the foremost ranks." Now consider the 2 chori side by side. What do you notice? You might notice right away that the proportions on the later chorus are much more human. The later chori is more naturalistic. There are better proportions. The hair is more natural. He has rounder hips. This shows the development of Greek sculpting over just 2 generations. Without abandoning the Egyptian stance, the sculptor renders the human body in far more naturalistic manner. The head is no longer too large, the face is rounded, swelling cheeks, and the hips are more lifelike. Temples in Greece reflect the Greek sense of proportion and the importance they play on order, compactness, and symmetry. Greek architecture and sculpture was much the same as harmony in music, reflecting and embodying the cosmic order. The multi-phase architectural development of sanctuaries such as that of Hera on the island of Samos demonstrate not only the change that occurred in construction techniques over time, but also how the Greeks reused sacred spaces, with the latter phases built directly atop the previous ones. Perhaps the fullest and most famous expression of classical Greek temple architecture is the Periclean Parthenon of Athens. A Doric order structure, the Parthenon represents the maturity of the Greek classical form. Here is the layout of a typical Greek temple. The temples were houses of the god or goddess. They're elevated. People gathered outside the temples, not inside for worship. This is the literal house of the god. Proportion, numerical relationships, and geometric rules totally ruled how the architects built these spaces. They are different from most later religious buildings because these temples were the house of the god or goddesses. Again, not an interior space for the worshippers to gather. The naos or cella was a room with no windows that usually housed the cult statue of a deity. The pronaos or porch, often with two columns between the ante or extended walls. A colonnade would be placed across the front of the temple, prostyle, or more commonly all around the cella and its porches to form a peristyle. Both the Doric and Ionic column orders were developed during the Archaic period. There are a ton of different elements, and all have to change if you change any of the different elements to correctly use these two orders of columns. Temple ornamentation was used partly to embellish the shrine and partly to tell something about the deity that was symbolized within, and they also partly served as a votive offering. They were concentrated in the upper part of the building in the frieze and the pediments. These, like other Greek sculpture, was usually painted. The Siphonian treasury in Delphi. This is a good example of a reconstruction of a typical Greek temple. Notice how it is painted. This was an extremely luxurious, and it employs human sculptures as columns, or caryatids, which support weight. This is an iconic temple, an Ionic temple construction, but is a treasury in the sanctuary of Apollo. You can see the different elements and the use of paint that would be common in Greek temple building. Black figure technique. This was learned from the Corinthians and involved applying slip and an intense firing process to create areas of black against the natural ground. Right now you want to take a break and go watch that video, which the link is on this, but it's also in the playlist for this week's lesson. So after black figure painting came red figure painting. This was invented in Athens around 530 BCE. In the red figure technique, an artist sketches figures on the red clay of a freshly fashioned vessel, then covers all the background with slip, which turns black after final firing. Details, like elements of anatomy, folds of drapery, etc., can be freely added with a thin brush. The slip can be darker, sometimes more diluted, brownish, adding even more variety. Here, we're comparing the black and red figure methods. There's greater freedom and flexibility with the red figure method to create livelier human figures with a more developed sense of bodily form, qualities that were increasingly demanded throughout all Greek artistic mediums. Now we're moving into the early and high classical periods. This is the golden age of Greece, with Sophocles and Euripides. Contrapposto is developed during this period. We also have perfect proportions, and the rebuilt Acropolis defining what it means to be classical. The Parisians sack the Athenian Acropolis, but the Greeks take it back a year later. The same mathematical proportions that were used to develop the canon of perfect proportions for statues was used on temple design in the belief that beauty resulted from the use of harmonic numbers. Contrapposto is the potential for movement. It's Italian for counterpose and indicates when a figure has most of its weight on one foot, with its body and shoulder twisting off axis. This is the way humans normally stand. It is one of the most important works because never before had a sculptor been concerned with portraying how a human being, as opposed to a stone image, actually stands. It demonstrates the development of statuary and showing human movement. Most Greek sculptures were in bronze. A lot of what we have today are actually Roman marble copies. The Athenian Acropolis. Acropolis means city on top of a hill. Under the leadership of Pericles, they worked on the reconstruction of the Acropolis after the Persian sack of 480. This contains the Parthenon, which originally held a huge statue of Athena. The site has been used by various religions over the centuries. It's a miracle it even still exists at all today. It started as a market with the agora and eventually a place of government and worship, focusing on Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. Here you can see the layout of the Acropolis, including the Parthenon, the statue of Athena, the picture gallery, the temple of Athena Nike, and the Erectathon. The late classical period sees the end of the Peloponnesian War. Athens is defeated by Sparta. During this period, art focuses more on the real world, the actual appearance of things. They still maintain the belief and practice that humanity is the measure of all things. Praxiteles causes a sensation when he portrays Athena in the nude. Lysippus depicted Heracles, or Hercules, as a strong man, but so weary he needed his club for support. Doric and Ionic columns go by the wayside. This period closes with Alexander the Great's conquest of most of the then known Western world. Praxiteles and Lysippus. They maintain the superhuman beauty and heroism of the gods while focusing on a humanizing spirit. These were the official Lysippus was the official portrait sculptor for Alexander the Great. High classical period sculptors like these broke the mold of perfection and attempted to attain something of a human spirit inside these statues in their art. These images are still ideal, as they portray unrealistic beauty and strength, but they are also lacking the solemn grandeur in place of a worldly sensuousness. See here the Aphrodite of Kindos. It caused a sensation when it was revealed. It caused a sensation because this portrayal of the goddess was human-like, sensuous, nude. And remember that while males were almost always portrayed nude, females hardly ever were in ancient Greece. She's soft. She has dewy eyes. This was a huge break with tradition from how images of Aphrodite were typically shown. We see a similar humanness here in this statue of Heracles or Hercules. See how, while he has superhuman strength, he is tired and must lean on his club. So why is there this sudden shift in art toward maintaining or exposing a humanity? Most likely, it was an expression of the war and the political upheaval and the chaos that these Greek artists and their culture had been going through. The Greeks had generally believed that rational human beings could impose order on their environment. But the unceasing strife at the end of the Peloponnesian War, toward the end of this century, and then with the Macedonian king's takeover of Greece, and then his assassination, and then the takeover of Greece by Alexander the Great, is toward the end of this century, brought an end to the serene idealism of the previous century. Disillusionment and alienation followed. So here we'll introduce Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great lived from 356 BCE to 323 BCE. He was 20 years old when he ascends the throne, and he is considered one of the greatest generals to have ever lived. He overthrew the Persian and Egyptian empires and made his way to India, but never conquered India. He marks the end of the High Classical and the beginning of Hellenism. He also establishes Greek language and culture as the pinnacle of culture at the time. He spreads Hellenism around the world. If you don't speak it, you're a barbarian, according to the Greeks. His favorite book was the Iliad, and he dominates the known world through incredible force and violence. He founded some 20 cities bearing his name, including Alexandria in Egypt. He became legendary in the mold of Achilles. Hellenistic art. With the death of Alexander, Hellenistic art lasts from the death of Alexander through the death of Cleopatra. Alexandria and Pergamon are the most important cities during this period rather than Athens, and most classical artistic rules are broken. New subjects in art, new ways of showing traditional subjects, and there's unbridled emotion and violent movement. It's during this period that Egypt becomes a province of the Roman Empire. This happens after the death of Cleopatra. The city-states are no longer the cultural capitals, but rather royal capitals like Alexandria, Antioch, and Pergamon. Temples with no roofs, temples within temples. These are some of the rules that are being broken. Sculptors explored new subjects like Gauls with strange mustaches and necklaces, or impoverished old women. Traditional subjects were treated in new ways, like athletes with battered bodies and faces, and openly erotic goddesses. This is the statue of the Laocoon. Some believe it to be the original Greek 1st century piece. Others say it is a genius copy. It illustrates an episode from the Trojan War, when the priest Laocoon warned the Trojans not to bring the giant wooden horse into their city walls. The gods who supported the Greeks retaliated by sending serpents from the sea to destroy Laocoon and his sons as soon as they walked along the shore. So describe what you see. What emotions are portrayed? Is this piece compelling? Does it show human emotion convincingly? What about the craftsmanship? Is it rendered convincingly? This is technically sculpture in the round, but it is composed to see frontally and at a close range. The figures here are writhing in pain, struggling to escape. Emotion well rendered. It has incredible craftsmanship, muscles, beauty, and strength of the human body, but also the mortality of humans, especially when faced with the wrath of the gods. And chance, a good example of Hellenistic skill, the use of emotion, of human emotion, and violent movement. Michelangelo would eventually study this piece, among other pieces in the Pope's collection, when working in Rome during the Italian Renaissance. The Barberini faun is another excellent example of the incredible naturalism that the ancient Greeks during the Hellenistic period achieved. It shows a restlessly sleeping semi-human in a drunken state. This is an incredibly erotic statue, but it's also incredibly naturalistic because it pays attention to how the human body works. But notice that it is still idealizing the human body. It is an incredible rendering, an amazing understanding of human anatomy, but the artist adds a turn in the torso to add movement. This piece demonstrates the antithesis of the classical ideas of rationality and discipline. Caravaggio, a Baroque Italian artist, would use this statue and the theme of the sleeping satyr to inspire similar works of his own. Coming up on the Venus de Milo, what do you notice that is different? The emotion or the movement from the previous Aphrodite that we looked at. Comparing here the Venus de Milo on the left and the Aphrodite of Melos on the right, we can see that the Venus de Milo on the left, the newer version, is more sexualized. She's more human. There's more movement in the twisting of the torso. But you can see how this particular sculptor is still utilizing classical ideals of the past. Not all Hellenistic sculptors broke as many classical rules as the sculptors of the Laocoon and the faun. So the fall of Greece and the Ptolemaic period in Egypt. Remember that Alexander the Great gives his Greek general Ptolemy his conquested territory in Egypt. Then Ptolemy's great-granddaughter, Cleopatra, reigns Egypt as pharaoh. The Fayum mummy portraits from Egypt show an incredibly interesting melange of the classical ideals of naturalism from the Greeks, but also the serenity from the ancient Egyptians. Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE marks the end of ancient Egypt and the end of ancient Greece.